We've done a lot of emailing on behalf of health tech companies, health and wellness style companies, both into health and wellness companies and into hospital and health systems. Those markets tend to be quite tricky, especially if they're larger, partially because a lot of the health companies in the United States are very, very large. And if companies are very, very large, that means that email deliverability becomes a challenge because their security is very high. But there are also other challenges that come with emailing into health and wellness and health related companies. Very small health clinics might have very few staff members that are in the way of buying the kinds of things you might be trying to sell. And they're not used to dealing with many outside vendors. So a cold email to them is actually kind of in the way of their patient related inbound and outbound. So they tend to have a relatively low response rate unless there's something very compelling about your product or service. And it also means that there's very little of the sort of extra interested replies where they say, "Oh, that sounds interesting," because white collar workers who are not in a patient related have sort of time in their day to explore things that are interesting to them, even if there's not a clear path to buying, if that makes sense. So you tend to be a little bit more on the annoying side if you're emailing into a small organization. On the flip side, very, very large organizations, the types of people you're emailing, assuming that the targeting and everything is correct, might actually be very interested in learning because they have very, very long timelines they're dealing with 3, 6, 9, 12 months out. And if you're working on something that's interesting, compelling in some way, they might be interested in learning about it either for the relatively near term or the far into the future. However, the issue is there are so many people who work at large health systems and their jobs aren't very clear. So someone with an analytics title, you might think, oh, we're an analytics product. This makes sense to them. But the angle and piece of analytics they might touch might be so far removed from anything that your product or service could do. They might say, well, actually, I'm on the phrenology team and I'm only looking at research data that has to do with kidney function or something really specific. And you're like, oh, well, I guess this doesn't really make sense. My data mesh product or whatever doesn't really make sense for this specific person, or maybe it does. For example, on the product side, there are a lot of product people who work at large health systems, and the product people might be the same way, where you have a health related thing that you think would make sense to a lot of product people, but the world of product that those particular players are in is so far removed from where you're selling into that you're basically emailing into a group of people that from the outside look like what you're doing makes sense for them, but on the inside it doesn't. This isn't to discourage you from emailing in. It just largely means that your emails have to be a little bit more of like a heat seeker type, where you have to acknowledge the fact that the person you're emailing might just very well be the wrong person. And there's no really good way to navigate inside their organization from the outside in most cases. So you're sort of asking them if they'll help you navigate. If you want to make a very obvious analogy, it would be like if you were looking for the Department of Phrenology at a hospital and you walked in the door and you asked anyone who walked by who had a staff badge on, how do I get there? Eventually, someone would point you to the right place and you'd find it. So you could see that this as a way of you're emailing into a large organization and you're trying to find the person that actually cares about what it is that you're offering. So you make your message, your value proposition, or whatever it is you're trying to do, but you also ask for some navigational help. And oftentimes, people do help you if the email gets through. Email deliverability is another challenge with large organizations, simply because their security environment makes it very difficult to email at a large volume towards them. And I say large volume, but even small volume, even 4 or 5 emails into the same company in a certain period of time might trigger their spam filtrations to say, hey, don't deliver any more emails from these. So extra considerations have to be put into place for those emails. As far as emailing directly to or aiming towards physicians, actual doctors, for whatever purpose that you're doing that, doctors don't tend to be super responsive over email, but that doesn't mean that they're not looking at and reading emails if it is a direct email scenario. So I would say, like with many other fields, um, they're very well educated, which means they can read and absorb lots of information really fast. But they also know that their job isn't usually to field emails from outside folks. That's not what really drives their revenue forward. There aren't a lot of good things that have come to them via email that have like really changed the game for them, so to speak. So it requires a lot of humbleness and a lot of buy-in. So that is to say, you can ask them if they'd like to see something else and get a very simple yes buy-in, and then you can deliver a PDF or whatever it is that's more substantive to sort of guide them through the buying process with you. The other side is, if you are reaching physicians in a direct manner, they might have other staff members that are actually better suited, but their clinic, their practice won't even judge your product or service unless it comes through the physician. So what you're basically doing is trying to get the physician to be like, yeah, that makes sense, but then really loop in someone else that has more time to actually assess your product or service. We've done a lot of emailing into these types of companies, and we're happy to speak through specific use cases and give you our read on whether or not we think that the security environment of the type of organization you're emailing into is going to be a serious detriment to actually having emails delivered. And there's also mitigation strategies that you can do in order to reduce the chances of bouncing or becoming blocked from their system. So feel free to reach out, and we're happy to chat it all through.